Elias Vance came to the mountains to outrun memories that had the persistence of wolves. They were patient, lean things, content to follow at a distance, their footfalls silent in the pine duff of his mind. He had chosen this specific slice of the Colorado high country for its profound indifference. The granite peaks did not care about the man he had been, and the wind that scoured the ridgelines had no interest in the ghosts that whispered his name in the quiet hours before dawn. He sought the kind of silence that was not merely an absence of noise, but a presence, a heavy, ancient thing that could press down on the past until it was thin and brittle as old paper. He lived in a small, reclaimed cabin tucked into a fold of the valley, a place the sun found late and left early. His days were governed by a discipline forged in harsher places. He rose before the first light, his movements economical and sure. He made coffee on a wood-burning stove, the hiss and bloom of the percolator a familiar liturgy. He wore the same uniform every day, a faded olive M65 field jacket, its fabric softened by 1,000 washings and a few hard rains. A plaid flannel shirt, usually red or blue, worn cargo pants with pockets that held a folding knife, a compass, and a tin of waterproof matches, and leather boots that had molded to his feet, their soles etched with the memory of miles he was trying to forget. On his wrist, the heavy, tritium-loomed face of a military-issue marathon watch measured out the steady, unyielding passage of time he was trying to render meaningless. His only companion was Ghost. The dog was a German shepherd, a veteran like himself, though his wars had been fought in different deserts. Ghost was 10 years old, and the noble black and tan of his muzzle was surrendering to a distinguished gray that crept up the bridge of his nose. He was not a pet. He was a partner. There was no sentimentality in their interactions, only a deep, abiding respect, built on a shared understanding of duty and the quiet language of professionals. Ghost did not bark without purpose, did not beg for affection. He observed, assessed, and measured the world with a calm intelligence that often felt more human than Elias's own hollowed-out watchfulness. When Elias sat on his porch in the evenings, staring at the alpenglow painting the peaks in impossible colors, Ghost would lie at his feet, not touching him, but close enough that Elias could feel the warmth radiating from his body, a silent anchor in the vast, lonely space. The dog was never entirely off duty. His ears were a constant barometer of the wilderness, swiveling to catch the snap of a twig 100 yards away, the distant cry of a hawk. Elias trusted the dog's senses more than his own. His own had been compromised by memory, by the phantom sounds of rotors and shouting in a language he no longer spoke. Ghost's senses were pure, untainted by regret. They dealt only in the present, in the immediate truth of scent and sound. It was on a cool morning in late September, when the aspens had begun their fiery transformation, that the routine was first broken. They were on their usual patrol, a wide, looping circuit of the valley floor that Elias walked every day, a perimeter check that had no real perimeter and no tangible threat, but the ritual soothed him. The air was crisp, smelling of pine and damp earth. Ghost walked at a perfect heel, his gait smooth and powerful. They reached a familiar clearing, a meadow where the tall grasses had been bleached to the color of straw by the summer sun. And then Ghost stopped. It was not a casual pause. His body went rigid, a statue of coiled muscle. His head was up, nose twitching, sampling the air. His ears were locked forward, aimed at the high, serrated ridge to the north, a brutal spine of rock and scree that was rarely touched by anything but snow and wind. Elias stopped too, his hand hovering instinctively near the knife in his pocket. He scanned the tree line, his eyes tracing the shadows, looking for the telltale shape of a bear or a mountain lion. He saw nothing. He heard nothing but the sigh of the wind through the pines. "What is it, boy?" he murmured, his voice a low rasp. Ghost didn't look at him. A low whine, a sound of profound unease, vibrated in the dog's chest. It was a sound Elias had heard only twice before. Once in a dusty marketplace overseas seconds before an explosion, and once during a training exercise when a recruit had missed a tripwire. It was the sound of something fundamentally wrong. Ghost took a hesitant step forward, then another, his gaze fixed on that distant, unforgiving ridge. He was not tracking an animal. This was different. This was a puzzle, an anomaly that his instincts could not categorize. Elias felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. For the first time in 2 years, the indifferent silence of the mountains seemed to be holding its breath, waiting. He trusted the dog. He always trusted the dog. And the dog was telling him that something was broken on that mountain. For 2 days, the feeling of wrongness lingered. Ghost remained unsettled. He would abandon his food midway through a meal to stand at the cabin door, staring north toward the ridge. His sleep was fitful, punctuated by soft whimpers. Elias found his own hard-won calm fraying at the edges. The dog's anxiety was a contagion, seeping into the quiet spaces of his routine. He found himself cleaning his rifle when it didn't need it, field stripping his knife and oiling the pivot with obsessive precision. He was a man who thrived on predictable patterns, and Ghost had introduced a variable he could not solve. On the 3rd morning, Elias woke to find Ghost gone from his usual spot at the foot of the bed. A prickle of alarm ran down his spine. He found him on the porch, standing rigid, a dark silhouette against the pale pre-dawn light. The dog was staring at the ridge again, but this time there was a new quality to his posture. It was not uncertainty anymore. It was resolve. As the first rays of sun crested the eastern peaks, Ghost turned his head and looked directly at Elias. The message was clear, as articulate as any spoken sentence. "We are going up there." Elias nodded slowly. "All right," he said to the dog and to himself. He packed his Eberlestock half-track with methodical care. Water, rations, a medical kit, rope, a headlamp, and a thermal blanket. He strapped a small hatchet to the side. He pulled on his jacket, checked the time on his watch, and met Ghost at the edge of the trees. There was no trail leading up the north ridge. It was a brutal climb through dense timber, over fields of loose scree, and across sheer rock faces. It was not a place one went by choice. Ghost led the way without hesitation. He moved with a purpose that bordered on obsession, scrambling over fallen logs and navigating the treacherous terrain with an agility that belied his age. Elias followed, his body moving with the familiar rhythm of a difficult ascent. The physical exertion was a welcome distraction, burning away the low-grade hum of his anxiety. He focused on the burn in his thighs, the rasp of his own breathing, the solid feel of rock under his worn boot soles. He let the mountain demand his full attention, a luxury the world below rarely afforded him. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher, filtering through the dense canopy of spruce and fir. They were high on the shoulder of the ridge now, the air thinner and colder. The valley floor was a distant patchwork quilt below. Ghost had not paused or slowed. His focus was absolute. Then he stopped again, this time at the base of a massive, gnarled ponderosa pine, one that had clearly been struck by lightning decades ago. Half of its trunk was a smooth silver scar. The dog began to whine again, that same low, troubled frequency. He pawed at the ground, at the thick carpet of needles and moss that had accumulated over years. Elias knelt beside him, running a hand over the dog's back. "Easy, boy, what did you find?" He pushed aside the forest debris. His fingers brushed against something cold, hard, and unnaturally smooth. He dug further, his curiosity now a sharp, focused point. He pulled the object free. It was a piece of metal about the size of his hand. It was painted a dull military olive green, but the paint was flaked and blistered, revealing the silvery sheen of aluminum beneath. One edge was jagged, torn with incredible force. He turned it over. Stenciled in faded black letters were 2 words. No step. His breath caught in his throat. He looked up, his gaze following the line of the terrain. His training kicked in, overriding his confusion. He was no longer just a man on a mountain. He was assessing a scene. He saw it now, the subtle things he had missed before. A line of younger trees, all roughly the same height, growing in a perfectly straight, unnatural furrow that ran up the slope. A series of deep, parallel scars in the granite face of a rock outcropping 50 yards above them. The canopy here was thinner, the older trees strangely absent. It was a scar on the landscape, a wound that the forest had spent half a century trying to heal and hide. He stood up, the piece of metal cold in his hand. Ghost looked up at him, a silent question in his intelligent eyes. "Yeah," Elias said softly. "I see it now." He began to move uphill again, his eyes scanning, processing, reading the land like a map. He followed the scar, the path of destruction that time had tried to erase. The wreckage was not in one place. It was a debris field, scattered over a quarter-mile of steep, unforgiving terrain. He found a section of landing gear, a wheel hub thick with moss. He found a twisted propeller blade embedded in the trunk of an old spruce, the tree having grown around it, embracing it like a memory. And then he found the main fuselage. It was wedged into a narrow ravine, almost perfectly hidden from the air by a thick overhang of rock and a dense growth of fir trees. It was a C-123 provider, a twin-engine cargo plane from another era. Its tail was sheared off, and one wing was crumpled like tinfoil against the ravine wall. But the main body of the aircraft was surprisingly intact, a great green beast asleep in a green cradle. Nature had claimed it. Moss grew in thick carpets over its skin. Vines snaked through the empty window frames. A family of marmots had made a home in the cavernous space of the broken wing. Elias approached with caution, Ghost at his side, a low growl rumbling in the dog's chest. The silence here was different. It was not the peaceful silence of the wilderness, but the heavy, watchful silence of a tomb. He peered through a shattered cockpit window. The controls were skeletal, picked clean by time and weather. He walked along the length of the fuselage until he found the main cargo door, which was jammed half open. He squeezed through the gap, his boots crunching on a floor of dried leaves and rusted metal shards. The interior was dark and smelled of decay, oil, and damp earth. Light filtered in through rents in the fuselage, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air like tiny spirits. The cargo bay was empty, stripped of whatever it had once carried. But this was not just a crash site. Elias's eyes, accustomed to the dark, began to pick out details that spoke of something else. In a corner, a small stack of tin cans, their labels long since rotted away, were piled with military precision. A tattered piece of parachute canopy had been stretched to form a makeshift tent against one wall, a pathetic but determined shelter. The seatbelts on the few remaining crew seats had not been broken. They had been cut, deliberately, with a knife. Someone had survived. Someone had lived here in this metal coffin for a time. They had tried to impose order on the chaos, to fight back against the inevitable. Ghost moved deeper into the shadows at the front of the cargo bay, toward the bulkhead that separated it from the cockpit. He stopped and sat, perfectly still, his gaze fixed on a section of the floor. It was the only spot in the entire aircraft that was free of debris. Elias knelt down and ran his hand over the metal plates. He felt a seam. He used the tip of his knife to pry at the edge. It was a maintenance hatch, but it felt heavier than it should. It took all his strength to lift it. Beneath it was a small, hidden compartment, and inside that compartment, nestled in a bed of what had once been yellowing foam insulation, was a single, sealed, military-grade footlocker. It was not cargo. It had been hidden. A surge of adrenaline, cold and sharp, shot through him. This was not an accident. This was a secret. Ghost had not led him to a grave. He had led him to a story that someone had gone to great lengths to bury. He looked at the footlocker, then at the aging dog who sat watching him, his gray muzzle a mask of solemn duty. The quiet of the mountains was gone, replaced by the ringing of 1,000 unanswered questions. The footlocker was too heavy to carry down the mountain alone. Elias secured the hatch, camouflaging it as best he could with debris, and made his way out of the fuselage. The descent was slower, more thoughtful. The piece of metal in his pocket felt heavy, a tangible piece of a puzzle he now felt compelled to solve. The mountain was no longer an indifferent sanctuary. It was a witness, and it had just shared its testimony. The next morning he drove his old truck into the small town of Havenwood, a place that clung to the base of the mountains like a hardy lichen. It was a town of one main street, a handful of shops, a gas station, and a county courthouse that looked like it had been built a century ago and had decided to stop aging. The air here smelled of diesel and coffee, a jarring contrast to the clean scent of his valley. He felt exposed, out of his element. The few people on the street looked at him with the mild, unthreatening curiosity reserved for strangers in a town where no one was a stranger for long. He walked into the county clerk's office. The room was filled with the comforting smell of old paper and floor wax. Sunlight streamed through tall, dusty windows, illuminating shelves packed with thick, leather-bound ledgers. Behind a polished wooden counter sat a woman in her late 50s. She was tall and spare, with sharp, intelligent eyes and graying hair pulled back in a severe bun. A small engraved plaque on her desk read, "Sarah Jenkins, County Clerk." She looked up from her paperwork as he approached, her expression neutral, but appraising. "Can I help you?" Elias placed his hands on the counter. He was not used to asking for help. "I'm looking for information," he began, his voice feeling rusty from disuse. "Records, specifically old survey maps of the North Range, and any incident reports from that area. Plane crashes, things like that." Sarah Jenkins raised an eyebrow. "That's a mighty specific request. The North Range is federal land, mostly wilderness area. Not much happens up there that requires paperwork." She studied him for a long moment, taking in the field jacket, the disciplined posture, the weariness in his eyes. "What kind of incident are you looking for?" He hesitated, unwilling to reveal everything. "I found something. Wreckage. Looks old." She typed something into an old computer terminal, the keys clicking loudly in the quiet room. She frowned at the screen. "Nothing. We've got records of a Cessna that went down in the East Valley in '88 and a Forest Service spotter plane that had a hard landing near Bishop's Peak in the '90s. Nothing on the North Ridge. Ever." "Are you sure that's where you were?" "I'm sure," Elias said, his voice flat. Sarah leaned forward, her gaze sharpening. "Some things up in those mountains are best left where they lie, mister. Some stories don't have happy endings." It was a warning, but there was something else in her tone too, a flicker of genuine concern. "I need to know what it is," Elias said simply. She seemed to see something in his quiet resolve that made her reconsider. She sighed, a sound of reluctant capitulation. "The county's official maps won't help you if it was military. Those records would be classified, or just buried. But there's someone you could talk to. Arthur Finch. He was the county surveyor for 40 years. Now he just collects maps and local history. If anyone has heard a whisper about a ghost plane on that ridge, it's Arthur." She wrote an address on a small piece of paper and pushed it across the counter. "He lives just outside town. Don't tell him I sent you. He thinks I don't appreciate his unverified local lore." Elias took the paper. "Thank you." "Be careful," she said as he turned to leave. "That mountain holds on to its secrets." Arthur Finch lived in a small, cluttered house overflowing with books and rolled-up maps. He was a man in his 70s, with a cloud of white hair and bright, inquisitive eyes behind thick spectacles. When Elias explained why he was there, Arthur's face lit up with an almost boyish excitement. He led Elias into a study where every surface was covered in historical documents, surveying equipment, and geological samples. "A C123 provider, you say? And the North Ridge?" Arthur breathed, his eyes wide. "Extraordinary. Absolutely extraordinary." He shuffled over to a massive flat file cabinet and pulled out a drawer. He carefully unrolled a large, hand-drawn topographical map from the 1960s. The official story, the one the Air Force put out, was that a plane like that, call sign Starlight 7, went down in the Pacific during a training flight out of California. A storm, they said. No survivors, no wreckage ever found. But there were always rumors. He tapped a bony finger on the map, on the exact area of the North Ridge. The old-timers, the miners and loggers who knew these mountains before the government declared them wilderness, they used to talk. They said they heard a plane that night, flying low and loud, engines screaming like they were tearing themselves apart. They said they saw a flash of light high on the ridge, but when the Air Force came to investigate, they spent a week searching the wrong valley, 10 miles to the south. Then they packed up and left, and the official report came out a month later. Pacific Ocean. Case closed. Arthur looked at Elias, his expression grim. They didn't want it found. They weren't looking for it. They were making sure no one else did. He pulled out another, more modern map and laid it over the old one. The access roads the logging companies used back then were all decommissioned in the 70s. That whole area was effectively sealed off. A perfect place to lose something forever. Elias felt the pieces clicking into place. A secret flight, a faked crash site, a hidden cargo. What was on it? That, Arthur said, leaning back, is the question, isn't it? Starlight 7 was officially listed as carrying meteorological equipment. A cover story so thin you could read newsprint through it. Those planes were workhorses. They carried troops, supplies, sensitive cargo, anything and everything. Armed with a new sense of urgency, Elias drove back to his cabin. He spent the rest of the day gathering equipment, block and tackle, pry bars, heavy-duty straps. The next morning, under a sky the color of steel, he and Ghost made the arduous climb back up to the wreck. The air was heavy, charged with the feeling of an approaching storm. It took him 3 hours of intense, punishing labor to rig the tackle and haul the footlocker out of the hidden compartment and through the cargo door. It was heavier than he'd expected, a dead, dense weight. He managed to lower it to the ground outside the fuselage just as the first drops of cold rain began to fall. The wind picked up, moaning through the broken skeleton of the plane. The locker was sealed with 2 heavy-duty military latches. They were corroded, but not locked. His heart hammered against his ribs as he forced them open with a pry bar. The screech of metal was loud in the sudden quiet between gusts of wind. He lifted the heavy lid. The contents were packed tightly, protected from the elements. On top lay a leather-bound logbook. He opened it. The pages were filled with neat, precise handwriting. The flight plan was logged from a private airfield in Nevada to an unscheduled stop in Canada. The manifest was below it. It listed not meteorological equipment, but 6 sealed crates of geological core samples, and under the heading Personnel, 4 names. They were not military. They were civilians. Beside each name was a designation. PhD, Geology. PhD, Environmental Science. Beneath the logbook were several metal canisters. He opened one. It contained not a film, but a reel-to-reel audio tape. He saw a small, battery-powered tape player packed in a waterproof bag in the corner of the locker. His hands shook slightly as he threaded the tape. He pressed play. A man's voice, calm and academic, filled the mountain air, tinny and laced with static but perfectly clear. This is Dr. Eris Thorne, lead scientist, Geological Survey Project 7 Gamma for the Sterling Mining Corporation. This recording is being made on October 12, 1968. It is my sworn testimony, and that of my colleagues, that Sterling has knowingly and willfully concealed evidence of a catastrophic leak of heavy metal contaminants from their uranium mining operations in the Painted Desert. Our core samples, secured aboard this aircraft, prove that the contamination has breached the aquifer and is poisoning the water supply for 3 downstream counties. We presented our findings to the board. They were dismissed. Our research was confiscated. We were threatened. This flight and this evidence is our last resort. We are taking it to the Canadian authorities beyond Sterling's reach. We pray that we... The tape ended abruptly with the sound of a violent lurch and a terrified shout. Elias sat back on his heels, the cold rain soaking his jacket, the doctor's words echoing in the ravine. Eris Thorne. He knew that name. No, not that name. The last name. Thorne. He felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. He dug deeper into the locker. He found the core samples in lead-lined tubes. He found maps detailing the toxic plume. He found corporate memos signed by a CEO with the same last name ordering the deliberate falsification of safety reports. It was all there. The complete anatomy of a crime and a cover-up, preserved in a metal box for 50 years. These people hadn't died in an accident. They had been silenced. A new sound cut through the wind and rain, a rhythmic, chopping sound that grew steadily louder. Elias looked up. A sleek black helicopter was descending through the low clouds, its landing lights cutting through the gloom. It settled into a small, rocky clearing 100 yards away. The side door slid open, and 2 men jumped out, followed by a third, who moved with an unhurried, proprietary air. He was a man in his late 40s, dressed in expensive, all-weather outdoor gear that looked like it had never been exposed to actual weather. His hair was perfectly styled, and his face was composed in an expression of pleasant, unassailable confidence. He walked toward Elias, his expensive boots crunching on the scree, a polite smile on his face. Ghost, who had been watching the helicopter with a low, continuous growl, rose to his feet and stood beside Elias, the fur on his back ridged. "Quite a find," the man said, his voice calm and reasonable, easily carrying over the wind. He stopped a respectful 10 feet away, his gaze flicking from Elias to the open footlocker, then back. "You must be the gentleman who's been asking questions in town." Elias didn't answer. He slowly got to his feet, placing himself between the man and the evidence. The man's smile didn't falter. "My name is Marcus Thorne. I'm the Executive Vice President for Risk Management at the Sterling Corporation. My grandfather was the founder. We've been looking for this plane for a very long time. It represents a sensitive piece of our corporate history. I'm here to reclaim our property." The name hit Elias like a physical blow. Thorne. Grandfather. He was standing face to face with the legacy of the crime he had just unearthed. "This is a gravesite," Elias said, his voice low and hard. It's a historical site, Thorne corrected smoothly. And the contents of that container are proprietary corporate assets. We have the full cooperation of the federal authorities to conduct this recovery operation. He gestured vaguely toward his men who were beginning to uncoil ropes and rigging. Of course, we're prepared to offer you a substantial finder's fee for your trouble, a token of our gratitude. Let's say $50,000 for your silence and your discretion. The offer was an insult, a casual attempt to purchase his conscience. Elias thought of the voice on the tape, the calm, desperate words of a man trying to tell the truth. He thought of the carefully stacked cans, the will to survive. It's not for sale, Elias said. Thorne's smile finally tightened at the edges. The politeness became a thin veneer over something cold and ruthless. Mr. Vance, we know who you are. We know about your service record, the commendations and the less distinguished parts. The incident in Kandahar, the inquiry. A man like you, a man who values his privacy, should understand the benefits of cooperation. This is a simple corporate matter. It doesn't concern you. Let us take what is ours and you can go back to your quiet life. It was a threat, delivered with the precision of a surgeon. He was offering to leave Elias's ghosts undisturbed if Elias would do the same for his. The memory of Kandahar rose up, hot and choking. The dust, the shouting, the impossible choice. Leave a wounded teammate to secure the objective or risk the entire mission for one man. He had followed orders. He had secured the objective. He had lived with the choice every day since. Elias reached down and picked up the small tape player. He rewound the tape for a few seconds and pressed play. Dr. Eris Thorne's voice once again filled the ravine, a ghost speaking truth to his own blood. Knowingly and willfully concealed evidence of a catastrophic leak. He pressed stop. The silence that followed was absolute. Marcus Thorne's face was a mask of cold fury. The pretense of civility was gone, burned away by the voice from the past. You are making a very serious mistake, he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. It was then that Ghost acted. He didn't bark or lunge. He simply took 2 steps forward, planting himself firmly in front of Elias, and the low growl in his chest deepened into a resonant, bone-jarring rumble. He bared his teeth, not in a panicked snarl, but in a calm, deliberate promise of violence. It was a clear, unambiguous statement. There is a line, and you will not cross it. Thorne took an involuntary step back. For the first time, a flicker of genuine fear showed in his eyes. He was a man used to controlling situations with money and words. But he was facing 2 things he did not understand. A man with nothing left to lose, and an animal whose loyalty was absolute. This isn't over, Thorne said, turning on his heel. He barked an order to his men. Pack it up. We'll be back. They retreated to the helicopter, and minutes later, the sound of its rotors faded into the storm, leaving Elias and Ghost alone with the truth in the rain. The storm broke that night with a fury that seemed biblical. Wind howled down the valley, and rain lashed against the cabin in solid sheets. Elias sat at his small table, the contents of the footlocker spread out before him. He read the logbook, examined the maps, and listened to all the tapes. He listened to the 4 scientists, one by one, giving their testimony, their voices a mixture of clinical precision and righteous anger. He was no longer just the finder of their story. He was its custodian. He owed them the truth he had denied his own fallen comrade. He knew Thorne would be back, and not with polite offers. He would come with force, with the quiet, efficient brutality of corporate power. Elias had to get the evidence out, but the storm had turned the single road out of the valley into a river of mud. He was trapped. He went to his shortwave radio, a relic he kept for emergencies. He broadcast a simple, coded message on a prearranged frequency he had given to Sarah Jenkins. Northridge has a story to tell. Weather is turning. Expect visitors. He didn't know if she would understand, or if she could do anything if she did, but it was all he could do. Dawn arrived gray and sullen. The rain had eased to a steady, miserable drizzle. Elias was packing the evidence into his backpack when he heard the helicopter. It was back, and it was not alone. A second, larger helicopter, a Chinook-style craft, followed it, carrying a slung load of heavy equipment. Thorne was not just coming to collect the locker. He was coming to obliterate this site. Elias and Ghost made their way back up the mountain. It was a treacherous climb, the ground slick with mud and wet leaves. He found a position in a cluster of rocks that overlooked the crash site, a perfect observation post. He watched as Thorne's team, larger now, swarmed the area. They set up portable generators and floodlights, cutting through the gloom. They were professionals, moving with a cold efficiency that reminded Elias of his own former life. One of them, a younger man with the unmistakable bearing of a former soldier, seemed hesitant, his movements lacking the conviction of the others. Elias watched him, filing the observation away. Thorne directed the operation, pointing and issuing orders, his expensive jacket now spattered with mud. They attached heavy cables to the fuselage, preparing to haul it out of the ravine piece by piece. They were erasing the evidence, sanitizing the scene. Elias knew he couldn't stop them physically, but he had the heart of the secret with him, in his pack. A winch on the larger helicopter began to whine, pulling a section of the wing up out of the ravine. The metal screamed in protest. As the massive piece of wreckage was lifted, it shifted the unstable ground around it. A cascade of mud and rock broke loose from the ravine wall, a miniature landslide. It surged downward, directly toward where Thorne and several of his men were standing. Elias saw it happening in slow motion. The men scrambled to get out of the way, but Ghost, positioned slightly downhill from Elias, was directly in the path of a large, dislodged boulder. The dog saw it coming and tried to leap clear, but his older legs weren't fast enough. The boulder rolled, catching his hind leg with a sickening crunch of rock and bone. Ghost yelped, a sharp cry of pure agony, and went down. The sound cut through Elias like a hot knife. Everything else faded away. Thorne, the evidence in his pack, the mission to expose the truth. All he saw was his partner, his friend, pinned and writhing in pain. The memory of Kandahar slammed into him with the force of a physical blow. The dust, the smoke, the screaming. His teammate pinned under a collapsed wall, hand outstretched, pleading with his eyes. The order crackling in his ear. "Leave him! Secure the high ground! Now!" He had obeyed. He had secured the high ground. And the image of that outstretched hand had been burned onto the back of his eyelids ever since. He was faced with the same choice. The mission, the evidence on his back, or his partner. Thorne and his men were distracted, dealing with the landslide. He could slip away now, get down the mountain, get the story out. It was the logical, tactical choice. It was the choice he had made before. "No," he whispered, the word a raw tear in his throat. "Not again." He slung his rifle, left the backpack containing the priceless evidence behind the rocks, and broke cover. He scrambled down the muddy slope, ignoring the shouted warnings from Thorne's men. He had only one objective. He reached Ghost, who was whining softly, his eyes glazed with pain. The boulder was immense, easily 500 pounds. He couldn't move it alone. "Hold on, boy," he grunted, his hands searching for purchase on the wet, slick rock. He put his shoulder to it, his muscles straining, his boots slipping in the mud. It didn't budge. Panic, cold and sharp, began to rise in his chest. "Get away from there!" Thorn shouted, approaching him. "That's company property you're interfering with!" Elias ignored him. His world narrowed to the dog and the rock. He saw the younger, soldierly man, Miller, he'd heard Thorn call him, watching them, his face a mask of conflict. Miller looked at Ghost, then at Elias's desperate struggle, then at Thorn's callous indifference. "Miller, get this lunatic out of here," Thorn commanded. Miller took a step forward, then stopped. He looked at Elias's M65 jacket, at the quiet, desperate competence in his movements. He saw not a lunatic, but a soldier trying to save his partner. A flicker of something, shame, solidarity, decency, crossed his face. "Sir," Miller said, his voice tight. "The animal is injured. We should help." "We have a schedule to keep," Thorn snapped. "That is not our concern. Now do as I say." In that moment of hesitation, Miller made a choice. He turned not toward Elias, but toward a portable generator that was powering the lights and winches. He stumbled, his large boot kicking the main power cable, yanking it from the generator. The lights flickered and died. The whine of the winches fell silent. The sight was plunged back into the gray, misty silence of the mountain, broken only by the sound of the rain and Ghost's pained whimpers. "What the hell are you doing, Miller?" Thorn roared. "Sorry, sir, slipped," Miller said, his voice devoid of apology. That small act of defiance, that brief window of chaos, was all Elias needed. He had seen a long, sturdy pry bar lying near some of Thorn's equipment. While Thorn was distracted by the power outage, Elias lunged for it. He wedged it under the boulder, found a solid rock to use as a fulcrum, and threw his entire weight onto the end of the bar. The rock shifted. A groan of protest came from the earth. He pushed again, every muscle screaming. The boulder moved, just an inch, then two. It was enough. He kicked loose rock and mud away, freeing Ghost's mangled leg. The dog yelped again, then dragged himself free, whimpering. Elias scooped him up into his arms. Ghost was heavy, a dead weight of pain, but Elias held him tight. As he straightened up, he found himself face to face with Thorn, whose features were twisted in a mask of pure rage. "You're finished, Vance," he hissed. But before Thorn could do anything else, a new sound filled the air. A siren. Faint at first, then growing louder, echoing up the valley from the road below. Elias looked toward the sound, and then looked back at Miller, who gave him a barely perceptible nod. Miller hadn't just kicked a plug. He had used the brief moment of confusion to key the microphone on his radio, broadcasting their location on an open emergency channel. Thorn heard the sirens too. The color drained from his face. His authority, built on secrecy and isolation, was evaporating. Public scrutiny was coming. Official questions would be asked. He was losing control. From the trail below, figures emerged from the mist. Sarah Jenkins, dressed in the green and gray of the Park Service, was in the lead, a determined look on her face. Behind her were two county sheriff's deputies, their hands resting on their sidearms. Sarah's eyes took in the scene in a single, sweeping glance. The heavy equipment, Thorn's furious face, Elias holding the injured dog, the open grave of the C-123. Her gaze finally rested on Elias. "Looks like you found that story," she said, her voice calm and steady. "And it looks like your visitors weren't invited." The game was over. The mountain had finally given up its secret, and the world was listening. The morning after was unnaturally calm. A weak sun worked to burn through the remaining clouds, and the air smelled clean, washed by the storm. The crash site was now a protected scene, cordoned off with yellow tape. The men in expensive outdoor gear were gone, replaced by quiet professionals from the NTSB and the Forest Service, who moved with a reverence that Thorne's crew had lacked. They were not there to erase history, but to preserve it. Marcus Thorne was sitting on a log near the trail, stripped of his authority. He was talking to two men in dark suits who had arrived with the dawn. Federal agents. His face was pale, his confident bluster replaced by a pinched, defensive posture. His polite words had failed him. The truth, raw and undeniable, was being carefully documented all around him. Elias sat a short distance away, by a small fire he had built. Ghost lay beside him on a thermal blanket, his injured leg cleaned and splinted with professional care by a deputy who was also a trained EMT. The vet would be coming up from Havenwood later, but the dog was stable. He was sleeping, his breathing deep and even, occasionally letting out a soft whimper. Elias gently stroked his head, his fingers tracing the line of gray on the dog's noble muzzle. He had made the right choice. He had stayed. For the first time since Kandahar, a measure of the crushing weight on his soul seemed to lift. He heard footsteps on the trail and looked up, expecting Sarah. But it wasn't her. It was a woman he hadn't seen in 3 years, not since the funeral he had fled from. His sister, Clara. She was smaller than he remembered, her face etched with worry, but her eyes were the same, kind and knowing. She stopped a few feet away, her gaze taking in the scene, the dog, and finally him. "I saw it on the news," she said softly. "A plane crash, a corporate cover-up. They said an unnamed veteran and his canine found it. I knew it was you." She took a hesitant step closer. "I called every sheriff's department in a 200-mile radius until I found one that knew where you were." Elias didn't know what to say. The years of silence had built a wall between them. "Clara," he managed, his voice thick. She looked down at the sleeping dog, then back at him. Her eyes were moist. "The report said you refused to leave your partner's side, even when he was injured. That you protected him." She paused, and her next words were loaded with a decade of unspoken history. "You stayed." It was not an accusation. It was an absolution. She was not just talking about the dog. She was talking about their father's long illness, about the funeral, about all the times he had run when things got hard. He had run from his family, from his past, from himself. But here, on this mountain, he had finally stopped running. He nodded, unable to speak. She came forward and, for the first time in years, put her arms around him. He was stiff at first, unused to human contact, but then he slowly relaxed, leaning into the embrace, a silent admission of how much he had missed it. Later that day, the full story began to emerge. The evidence from the footlocker was irrefutable. The Sterling Corporation was facing a massive federal investigation. The story of the 4 scientists who had died trying to expose the truth was on every national news network. They were no longer silent ghosts on a forgotten mountain. They were heroes. The poisoned land they had tried to save would finally be cleaned. Their sacrifice had been given meaning. The authorities officially designated the crash site a historical landmark and a memorial. The town of Havenwood, once a quiet backwater, found itself at the center of a national story. Arthur Finch became an unlikely media star, giving interviews about the local legends that had turned out to be true. Sarah Jenkins was praised for her role in coordinating the official response. And Miller, the conflicted insider, had given a full statement to the FBI, becoming a key witness against his former employer. He had chosen his own form of loyalty. A week later, Elias stood on the porch of his cabin. Ghost was beside him, his leg in a cast, but his tail gave a weak thump-thump against the wooden planks. The valley was quiet again. the intrusion of the outside world having receded. Elias looked at his reflection in the dark glass of the window. He saw the same worn jacket, the same tired lines on his face. But the man looking back at him was different. The haunted look in his eyes was gone, replaced by a quiet resolve. He was no longer a man in exile. He was a man who had found his place. His sister had left the day before, but not before making him promise to call. It was a beginning. He had decided to stay. Sarah Jenkins had offered him a position helping the Forest Service map and patrol the remote wilderness areas, a job that would combine his skills with his love for the mountains. He had even considered volunteering for the local search and rescue team. His skills could be used to find people now, not to fight them. He looked north, toward the ridge. It no longer seemed menacing or indifferent. It felt like an old friend, a keeper of stories. He thought of the wreckage, now resting under official protection, a silent monument to courage. He had come to these mountains seeking silence, a place to forget. Instead, he had found a story that demanded to be heard, and in giving it a voice, he had begun to find his own again. Months passed. The fire of autumn gave way to the deep, silent white of winter, and then melted into the vibrant, improbable green of spring. Elias's life settled into a new rhythm, one not of escape, but of presence. He took the job with the Forest Service, his days spent walking the high country, not as a man running from his past, but as a guardian of its present. He and Ghost, who now walked with a slight, dignified limp, knew the trails and ridges better than any map. His calls with Clara became a weekly ritual, a steady, reassuring link to a world he had once abandoned. One clear evening in early summer, he and Ghost stood on an overlook, the same one from which they had first seen the ominous North Ridge. The sun was setting, bathing the peaks in a soft, ethereal light. The valley below was peaceful, a patchwork of shadow and gold. Ghost sat beside him, leaning his weight gently against Elias's leg, a rare and profound gesture of contentment. Elias rested his hand on the dog's head, feeling the steady, reassuring presence that had led him out of his own wilderness. He was not cured, he knew that. The ghosts of Kandahar would always be with him, but they no longer held dominion. They were a part of his story, not the end of it. He had faced the echo of his greatest failure and had made a different choice. He had chosen loyalty. He had chosen to stay. And in doing so, he had saved more than just his dog. He had saved himself. The mountain held its breath, not in suspense, but in a quiet, shared peace. He had come seeking indifference, and had found grace. And as the last light faded from the sky, Elias Vance was finally home.